My name is Mel and welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking all about some of my favorite books with a bit of a Taylor Swift spin. So I know everybody is super excited for the Eras tour. I thought it would be fun to give you one book recommendation for each of the Taylor Swift eras. So if you're a Swiftie or if you just love talking about books, go grab a coffee, let's meet back here, and we'll get started. The first era that we'll talk about today is, of course, Taylor's debut era. So for debut, I always think of this as the kickoff to the big Taylor multiverse, similar to how Cassandra Clare kicked off the Shadowhunter universe with City of Bones. If you haven't read any of the Shadowhunter books yet, where have you been? This is a series that starts all the way back in the Victorian era of London, and it comes all the way forward to modern day in Los Angeles. We have the Mortal Instruments series, we have the Infernal Devices, the Dark Artifices, and now the Last Hours. Basically, the Shadowhunters are a group that's tasked with making sure mortals are protected from demons. This is a fantasy, it's an urban fantasy, and what Cassandra Clare does so well is she writes love stories, which is another reason I think this is perfect to represent Taylor's debut, because who writes love stories better than Taylor? So for debut era Taylor fans, I would definitely recommend you check out City of Bones. For Taylor's Fearless era, we're definitely maturing, we're getting a bit older, but we still have some of that youthful innocence. So that's why I've decided that I'm going to choose a middle grade, and the middle grade I've picked is The Bridge Home by Padma Kenkatrama. This book is a bit of a challenging read, but it's also a really important one, and it's one that I think is so beautifully written, which I think is also another reason why it relates perfectly to the Fearless era, because I think the songs on Fearless were beautifully written as well, even though they dealt with some hard topics, especially for 14 or 15-year-old Mel. The Bridge Home deals with a group of actually homeless children in India who are experiencing the world, and we get to experience through their eyes. What I loved most about this is I really think it's interesting about how we can see something that as adults we know is not so great, but when we see it from a child's perspective, they make it seem magical and whimsical, and I think that's what this book did really, really well. I think it's a fantastic middle grade, so definitely check it out. And of course, it's yellow too. Perfect for Fearless. For the Speak Now era, we're probably getting into my favorite Taylor era, which means I definitely had to pick one of my all-time favorite books and reading experiences. Now, this is going to be a bit of a fun one, but I would suggest for Speak Now era, Jennifer Dugan's Hot Dog Girl. Hot Dog Girl follows the story of Lou Parker as she works at her community or county fair over the summer selling hot dogs. She is the girl that has to dress up like a hot dog every summer in order to increase business. This book follows her journey over the summer, and it also talks all about how she maybe develops a bit of a summer crush. This is an LGBTQ+ romance. It's all about finding your identity. It's all about coming of age. I think it's perfect for the Speak Now era. Now we're into our Red era, and for me, this era is all about heartbreak. So I'm actually going to choose a book I just finished on my Kindle. It's called 7 Days in June, and it is by Tia Williams. In 7 Days in June, we're following our two main characters who were high school sweethearts, but they fell apart, and they fell apart in kind of a very dramatic way. They eventually grow up to both become best-selling authors, one a romance author, and they end up writing each other into their books until eventually they meet at a convention years and years down the road, and we get a bit of a would they, wouldn't they romance. Next up comes our retro era. We're into 1989, where we discovered all about the 1980s through music and, if you read Ready Player One, then through books and video games as well. Ready Player One is by Ernest Cline, and it is probably my all-time favorite book. Ready Player One follows Wade Watts as he makes his way through a series of quizzes and tests and scavenger hunts to try and find the keys to the Oasis. The Oasis is actually a virtual reality world, so you can put on this headset, you can put on an entire bodysuit, and all of a sudden it feels like you're somewhere totally different. And in this reality, we're set quite a bit in the future here. This is actually how people work, this is how they go to school. Nobody does these things in real life anymore. Everybody is doing them through the Oasis. So the Oasis is kind of the big virtual reality platform that everyone is participating in. Wade spends essentially all of his time in the Oasis because his real life is not so fun, and you get to learn all about that through his perspective. And then you get to go on this really, really fun scavenger hunt with Wade's best friends that he meets through this game. This is a real love story to not only online friendships, but I also think through video games and just how kind of an important part they can play in a lot of people's lives. And I think that's especially true of people growing up. I think if you love some of the nostalgic feel that you get when you listen to 1989, you'll definitely love Ready Player One. It's also filled with lots and lots of pop culture references. It's a fun read. It's so fast-paced. It's one that I think you're not going to be able to put down. So I would highly suggest this to absolutely everyone. Next up, we are in our Reputation era, where things go a little bit unexpectedly dark, just like they did when I read my best friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This is such a fun read. It's about two best friends, one of whom we suspect has been possessed by a demon. The other is trying to save her life. Now, what we actually find out is that the possession is probably a bit of a metaphor for something that I think lots of people experience. So just make sure that you do check out those trigger warnings, and then if you are in the right headspace, jump into this really, really fun ride of a book. Next, we're into our Lover era, and Lover is, of course, the era all about falling in love. So let me tell you about the time I absolutely fell in love with Anna Marie Mclemore, in particularly the book Wild Beauty. In Wild Beauty, we follow a family of predominantly women who were told that if they do fall in love, they will be cursed, and unfortunately, that person won't survive. This book is very lyrical, it's very beautifully written, and it is ultimately just the most beautiful love story. Not only a love story in the traditional sense, but it also talks about the love story between different family members, which I think is such a beautiful thing to find in writing. I would say Anna Marie Mclemore is probably one of my all-time favorite authors, just in general. I love all of their writing. I think it's also lush and also lyrical, but this book in particular holds a special place in my heart. I think if you love love stories, if you love reading about love, and if you also love really lush and beautiful atmospheric writing, please check out Wild Beauty. Next, we are headed into our folklore era, which for me is a very interesting era to try and get vibes from. This is probably the album I love listening to the most, but it's also the one that I had the most hard time finding a book that I think perfectly matches those vibes. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's probably because it's not necessarily written from Taylor's perspective. It's instead a book all about storytelling, and that's essentially what all books do. So this was a tricky one. But if you focus on the love triangle between August, James, and Betty, perhaps you might like the love triangle in Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses. We're following a character named Fair who accidentally kills a fairy, and her punishment is that she has to be taken from the human realm and into the fairy realm, where she then meets a myriad of characters who she is going to have lots and lots of adventures with. So let's put it that way. There is a huge love triangle in this book and then the next coming books in the series, which I think is so fun to read about. These books are super popular. I'm sure you've all heard of them before. They're definitely a quick read, but they do have my whole heart, so I'm glad I got to talk about them in my favorites. So I always think of Evermore as the quieter album. It's the one that we didn't get a whole bunch of big singles from. We never got a tour from Evermore, of course. We didn't get as many performances. So I always think of it as the quieter one that slips under the radar. Similarly to how manga has slipped under the radar for me. For this particular era, I want to suggest that if you like Evermore, you might also like I Want to Eat Your Pancreas. I Want to Eat Your Pancreas is the story about a terminally ill teenager who falls in love towards the end of their time here. And this is all about their story of how they grapple with that while also just trying to be normal teenagers and trying to have the best possible life that they can. This is a really beautiful book, but it's also really heartbreaking. So if you love those heartbreaking songs on Evermore, I think this is one you're definitely going to want to pick up. Make sure you have some tissues nearby. This is definitely a tearjerker. Last but not least is, of course, the Midnight Era, which to me is like a fever dream. I love the Midnight Era, but I think it's so magical and so whimsical, and you kind of never know what's coming. There's been lots and lots of surprises in this era, which I think represents The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern absolutely perfectly. Not only is this book filled with beautiful imagery all about stars, of course, I also think this has a really beautiful story, but it's one that you get in segments and you have to put together. This book is written similarly to a puzzle. So if you're someone that likes putting together puzzles, you are going to adore this book. If you're someone that loves a straightforward plot, you're absolutely not. You're going to put this book away. But I think this book is so much fun because we get snippets of information and together over time they start to make a story. And I think that is similar to the Midnight album as well. We're getting snippets of Taylor's perspective, and then together overall they make an album, which I think is so cool and such a fun link between these two. So those are all the books that I have to talk about today. Those are some of my favorites. That's definitely not an all-time favorite list, but they're definitely some of my all-time favorite books that I've really enjoyed reading that I think you'll like if you are a big fan of any of the Taylor Swift eras. I hope you're all having tons and tons of fun reading this week. I hope you have the best day ever. And wherever you are, thank you so much for watching. I always really appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.